My name is Sophia, and for 25 years I lived believing I was an only child. For 25 years, I grew up with an inexplicable emptiness in my chest, as if a part of me was lost somewhere I couldn't reach. My parents were always evasive when I asked about family, about distant relatives, about why we didn't have old photos at home. They quickly changed the subject, and I learned from a young age not to pursue these questions too much. But 3 weeks ago, everything changed. 3 weeks ago, I found out I had a brother. No, actually, I had a brother. And what happened to him on the day I was born is something that still wakes me up in the middle of the night with my heart racing. Let me start from the beginning, because this story needs to be told in the right order for you to understand the magnitude of what my family hid from me my entire life. It was a rainy Thursday when I received a call from an unknown number. On the other end, a female voice asked me if I was Sofia Mendes, daughter of Roberto and Maria Mendes. I nodded, with that natural distrust we have when someone we don't know knows too much about our lives. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Helena Carvalho, a psychiatrist at San Jose Hospital, where I was born. She told me she urgently needed to speak with me about information she'd found in the hospital's old archives. My heart began to pound. Why would a psychiatrist be calling me about my birth after 25 years? We arranged to meet at the cafe near the hospital the next day. I arrived 15 minutes early, nervous, fiddling with my phone nonstop, trying to imagine what she could possibly want with me. When she arrived, I recognized her immediately by the white lab coat beneath her coat. She was a woman in her 50s, with gray hair tied back in a bun and a serious but kind look in her eyes. She sat down across from me and bluntly asked me if I knew I had a twin. The world stopped. Literally stopped. I felt like someone had sucked all the air out of the room. Twin? What do you mean, twin? I mumbled something about it being impossible, that my parents never told me anything, that I always knew I was an only child. Dr. Helena opened an old folder, yellowed with age, and began showing me documents. Certificates, medical records, handwritten notes. Everything confirmed. My brother Gabriel and I were born on the same day, in the same hospital, only 8 minutes apart. He was born first. But then came the question I was dying to ask. Where is he now? And that's when Dr. Helena looked me in the eye with a way I'll never forget. A look full of pity, of weight, of a truth she clearly didn't want to tell. Gabriel died 2 days after birth, but it wasn't a natural death. And here's where the story gets truly disturbing, where everything I thought I knew about my family began to crumble like a house of cards. Dr. Helena explained to me that, at the time, she was just a psychiatry resident, but she was on call at the maternity ward that weekend. She remembered the incident perfectly because it had had a profound impact on her, something she could never forget. My mother had experienced complications during childbirth, and both Gabriel and I were born prematurely, requiring special care. For the first 2 days, we were fine. We were breathing on our own, gaining weight. Everything was within the expected range for premature babies. My parents came to visit us every day, several times a day. Dr. Helena specifically remembered my mother's dedication, how she would spend hours looking at us both through the glass in the neonatal ICU. But on the second night, something changed. She told me that my father arrived at the hospital alone, around 2 a.m. He said my mother was feeling unwell at home and couldn't come. He seemed nervous, anxious, a contrast to the calm man the medical staff had known the previous days. What happened in the next few hours was reconstructed by Dr. Helena through her own memories and some records she managed to find in the archives. My father asked to spend some time alone with us in the neonatal ICU. At the time, the rules were less strict, and since he was the father, he was allowed. At 5 a.m, the alarms started going off. Gabriel was in cardiac arrest. The on-call team rushed to revive him, but it was too late. When they asked my father what had happened, he said he'd noticed Gabriel was having trouble breathing and immediately called the nurse. Gabriel was pronounced dead at 5:43 in the morning. The official cause was sudden infant death syndrome, something that, unfortunately, happens without apparent explanation. My parents were devastated. My mother had to be sedated when she heard the news. They decided to discharge me a few days later and never spoke of Gabriel again. But here's what Dr. Helena discovered years later, and what made her seek me out now. She always thought it was strange how Gabriel had been fine the day before and then simply stopped breathing. A few years after graduating, when she was already a specialist, she began studying infanticide cases and noticed some patterns that reminded her of my brother. She told me that in cases where one parent can't handle the pressure of having twins, especially premature twins who require special care and high medical costs, it's not uncommon for something called induced natural selection to occur. It's a horrific technical term for an even more horrific reality. One parent chooses which baby has the best chance of survival and eliminates the other. I remember feeling physically and emotionally sick when she explained this to me. How could a mother or father make such a choice? How could they look at two innocent babies and decide who lives and who dies? But Dr. Helena wasn't finished. She showed me some notes she'd found, written by herself at the time, about my father's behavior that night. Notes she'd completely forgotten about until she found the file weeks ago. According to his observations, my father had repeatedly asked about the cost of treatments, how long we would need to stay in the hospital, and which of us was responding better to medical care. He had specifically asked whether it would be possible for one baby to survive if the other didn't, whether this would affect my chances of normal development. And then she told me about the conversation that changed everything. The day before Gabriel died, my father had taken Dr. Helena aside and asked her, hypothetically of course, if it were necessary to choose between saving one baby or another, what would be the wisest medical choice? She told him that such a choice would never be necessary, that we were both responding well to treatment. But my father persisted in his question. Which of us had a better prognosis? Which of us was more likely to lead a normal life? Dr. Helena, thinking it was just parental anxiety, replied that I was slightly more developed, that my reflexes were a little stronger, but that these differences were minimal and meant nothing in the long run. The next morning, Gabriel was dead. Now, 25 years later, with decades of experience treating domestic violence and infanticide cases, Dr. Helena was convinced that my father had murdered my brother. She had no concrete proof, no physical evidence, but all the signs were there. The behavior, the questions, the opportunity, and most importantly, the absolute silence about Gabriel's existence during all these years. I left that cafe completely destroyed. It felt like my entire life was a lie, like I was living in someone else's shoes. Worse still, it felt like I was living in my own brother's shoes, like my existence had a price I never knew had been paid. I drove to my parents' house in shock. It was a house I knew like the back of my hand, where I'd grown up, where I felt safe. But now, every corner, every photo on the wall, every memory held a different weight. How many secrets did these walls hide? I found my parents in the garden, tending the plants as they did every afternoon. My mother, with her white hair tied back in a ponytail, watering the roses. My father in a straw hat, pruning the bushes. They seemed so normal, so peaceful. How could these people have hidden the existence of a son for 25 years? I took a deep breath and asked, "Are you guys going to tell me about Gabriel? Or am I going to have to figure it all out on my own?" The watering can fell from my mother's hands. My father stopped pruning and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was a mixture of terror, guilt, and relief. Was that relief I saw in his eyes? We sat on the back terrace, where we had so often had Sunday lunch as a family. But this time, the mood was completely different. There was a tension in the air that made even the birds seem quieter. My mother began speaking first, her voice trembling. She told me about her twin pregnancy, how happy but also terrified they were when they learned they would be having 2 babies. Their financial situation wasn't the best at the time. My father had lost his job a few months earlier, and the prospect of raising 2 premature babies, with all the medical expenses that would entail, left them desperate. She told me about the sleepless nights, the arguments over how they would support 2 children, the fears for my health and Gabriel's. And then she stopped talking. She simply stopped, as if the words had been sucked from her mouth. That's when my father took over the conversation. And what he told me over the next 2 hours was something I'll never be able to forget or fully forgive. He confirmed to me that he had murdered Gabriel. Not in those words, of course. He used terms like he had to make a difficult choice. He thought about the family's well-being. Gabriel was suffering. But deep down, all these justifications were just ways of saying he had suffocated my 2-day-old brother. He explained to me that that night in the hospital, looking at us both in the incubator, he made the decision that he could only raise 1 child properly. He chose to save me because, according to the medical opinion he had requested, I had a slightly better prognosis. My father told me how he held a small pillow over Gabriel's face for a few minutes, how my brother stopped moving, how he waited a few more minutes before calling the medical team in a feigned panic. He told me how he rehearsed the story of sudden infant death syndrome, how he convinced my mother it was an inevitable tragedy, how they decided never to speak of Gabriel again to protect me from the pain. Throughout this confession, I felt like I was watching a horror movie about someone else's life. There was no way this man, who had taught me to ride a bike, who had attended every school meeting, who brought me ice cream when I was sad, could murder a baby, his own son. But what shocked me most was my mother's reaction. She knew. All these years she knew what had really happened to Gabriel. She had chosen to believe my father's version. She had chosen to live with that lie. She had chosen to raise me as if nothing had happened. When they finished speaking, we sat in silence for a long time. I stared at these 2 people who had been my heroes my entire life, unable to process that they were, in fact, a murderer and his accomplice. How could I continue to love them knowing what they knew? How could I look at them without thinking of Gabriel? I left home that day and never went back. For the past 3 weeks, I've been living in a small apartment on the other side of town, trying to process all of this, trying to understand who I really am now that I know the truth about my origins. The hardest part isn't even the anger I feel toward my father. The hardest part is the guilt. The guilt for being alive when Gabriel is dead. The guilt for having been chosen. The guilt for having lived 25 happy years while my brother was buried in a cemetery I didn't even know existed. Because yes, I went and found his grave. A small, simple tomb with only the name Gabriel Mendez and the dates of his birth and death. No flowers, no sign that anyone had visited in recent years. I knelt there and asked for forgiveness. Forgiveness for having lived the life that should have been ours to share. Forgiveness for not having known of his existence. Forgiveness for having parents who were capable of what they did. Dr. Helena told me I should consider reporting my father to the authorities. That even after 25 years, murder doesn't have a statute of limitations. That I have a responsibility to seek justice for Gabriel. But how can I send my father to prison? How can I completely destroy the life of my mother, who, despite everything, has always genuinely loved me? I'm torn between the pursuit of justice and the love I still feel for them, even knowing what they're capable of. It's a contradiction that tears me apart every day. I love and hate the same people at the same time. I'm grateful to be alive, but I feel guilty about that gratitude. Today, 25 years after the birth that should have resulted in 2 happy children, I'm here telling you this story because I need to share this burden with someone. Because carrying this secret alone is killing me inside. I don't know what the next step will be. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive my parents. I don't know if I'll report them, or if I'll try to rebuild our relationship based on this terrible new truth. What I do know is that Gabriel deserves it.